Tonight, an advanced society in an ancient world now stands charged with cannibalism. One man is obsessed with digging up the truth. Has he found it? And do we dare listen? Uncover the secrets of the dead. Secrets of the Dead was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
The American Southwest, a harsh land of desolate beauty. Yet this marginal place has been home to many societies over time. Around 200 AD, a legendary one arose here, commonly known as the Anasazi. This ancestral Pueblan people flourished for more than 1,000 years. Their center, Chaco Canyon, is now perhaps the most visited but least understood archaeological site in all of the Southwest. Little is known about these ancient people, but archaeologists and historians have viewed them as a model society. Peaceful, democratic, a near utopia. We know they cultivated maize and observed the stars. They built a world of sophisticated architecture, engineering and urban planning, of astronomical record-keeping, and pottery adorned with fine art. But all that was shattered around 1200 AD. When these ancestral Pueblans seemingly disappeared. To this day, no one knows exactly why. They left behind abandoned buildings and their bones. Today, new forensic findings are casting this ancient and supposedly peace-loving people in a new light, and a darker image is emerging. Unearthing the facts has been one man's professional obsession.
We look around at this beauty. It's incredibly beautiful. But something happened here that was not pleasant.
Physical anthropologist Christy Turner has spent the last 30 years examining the bones of those who lived and died in the ancient Southwest.
When we look at a child is very hard to deal with. It's easier to see this as an object. But on the other hand, if we look at it very closely, we can begin to see things about the child. We can tell from the kinds of dental wear and the kinds of dental damage that the child had been, relatively healthy up to a certain point, but this episode stopped the child's life. Notice that the nose is broken, the blown out sockets of the teeth. We think this kind of damage results from having been hit in the face with a stone, but we cannot tell if the child was alive or if it was dead at the time this happened.
Once a forensic consultant to law enforcement agencies, now a professor at Arizona State University, Turner has devoted much of his professional career to investigating a unique kind of violence. He believes that life in the ancient Southwest was much more brutal than ever suspected.
The Anasazi have been portrayed as peaceful, happy farmers, with no problems. But you will see the evidence of violence and warfare almost every place you look. Now, people don't seem to have any problem with violence. You can attack a town, kill 800 people, nobody gets too excited. But people have a big problem watching in this great town, watching our evidence say that someone was being eaten.
Cannibalism. Humans butchered, cooked, and eaten. Such a disturbing practice that few scientists until recently were even willing to investigate it.
If you infer what happened here, and you follow the inferences and their logical tracks, you come to a very, very emotional set of events going on. The history indicates that people are screaming, the women are begging not to be killed, the men who tried to help them get mutilated. They mutilate the people while they're alive, they're cutting their arms off while they're alive, and some of these scenes are horrible. And if you let yourself see these things, it becomes very difficult to be objective about what you're doing and dealing with.
Although Turner saw disturbing signs of violence in the bones, early on he wasn't sure they indicated cannibalism.
We accidentally came across some human remains that we could not understand. We went ahead and studied those remains. We gave a report on those remains in a major meeting. The public didn't buy into it, but there was one man in the crowd, Alan Brew, who came up afterwards and said, "I've got another mass of human remains exactly like you described." And from that point on, from those two analyses, it became very obvious that we were dealing with something that had been missed by all but a few southwestern archaeologists.
It was in 1969 that Turner, as a young professor, presented his controversial paper describing traces of cannibalism. Over the following 3 decades, he and his late wife Jacqueline amassed evidence of cannibalistic practices. Turner has argued his case in print and in the classroom.
There's a pattern of decapitation and then roasting of the head to a certain degree, not too much. Okay? You don't want to burn everything up. You don't want to walk off and ruin your dinner. Okay? So,
lined up against him and his controversial theories are Native American tribes like the Hopi and the Zuni and their clans, who consider themselves descendants of the ancestral Puebloans. They charge that Turner's claims are shockingly inaccurate.
First of all, on the issue of violence and cannibalism, we do have some memory of different types of violent behavior inflicted upon Hopi people. We do not have any traditions about any of the 60 or so clans that we know once existed of inflicting any kind of behavior that extreme against any other Hopi clan.
But Turner believes he has identified clear and convincing evidence of cannibalism. The findings come from sites throughout the Four Corners region, and even in Chaco Canyon itself, the very heart of this ancient society. From the narrow rooms and round kivas, the ceremonial chambers of these early Americans, Turner has returned time and time again to the long-ignored bones discovered in and around this canyon by generations of early archaeologists. The story begins more than 100 years ago, when the first archaeologists came here in the late 1800s. They noticed human bones scattered among the rocks. Most ancient burial sites are orderly, showing reverence to the dead. But here in the Southwest, some ancestral Pueblan sites were different. Bones were mangled, crushed, tossed aside like common refuse. No one knew exactly what it all meant, but they had their suspicions. Trader, guide, and pioneering archaeologist Richard Wetherill led the first major expedition into Chaco Canyon in the 1890s. The field supervisor of those excavations wrote,
"Some of our workmen cleaned out a number of rooms, and in one of these, a great many human bones were found. Some of these, including portions of the skull, were charred, and the majority of the long bones had been cracked open. It would therefore seem that these Pueblo Indians, either through stress of hunger or for religious reasons, had occasionally resorted to the eating of human flesh."
In November of 1902, the popular press got hold of the story. Harper's Monthly published an article about early finds and claims of cannibalism. But these stories, along with Wetherill's findings, faded into obscurity, lost to history. Ultimately, Wetherill himself was murdered and buried not far from where he dug in Chaco. Yet to Turner, Wetherill and his colleagues were trailblazers.
They had identified cannibalism, they had identified violence. They did not have an explanation, but they got it right. They got it right. And what bothers me is why is my profession ignoring what these people did?
Retracing the footsteps of Wetherill and the archaeologists who followed, Turner confirmed that what they had found among these hills were not just the typical findings of any graveyard. In at least one of every 50 cases, the trail led to murder, and worse. Bodies were dismembered, bones broken into fragments. These ancient remains reminded Turner of the way early hunters butchered wild game for consumption. Though no butchering expert himself, Turner tested his theory firsthand.
I didn't go to school, and this stuff is so tough. Meat is tough to tear apart, okay? It won't come apart, okay? Now, look at all these fractures. Look at all these little tiny pieces that have come from my hitting this bone. So what do we have here? Look at this. This is what goes into the pot, okay? This is meat processing, okay? They're processing people for the same reason they're processing animals, okay? They're breaking animals open for the same reason.
To turn a human into meat is an act so reviled that the charge has provoked many American Indians. Turner's claims strike them as no less than cultural slander.
Cannibalism, of course, is a very extreme human behavior. We now have science making all kinds of judgment on who was doing what to whom.
In the face of many doubts from American Indians and scientists alike, Turner set his standards high. He wanted to develop a rigorous series of forensic indicators that would have to be present before he could claim that the remains had been cut, cooked, and consumed.
Now we have a minimum of 6 criteria that have to be present before we will draw a conclusion that we have possible cannibalism.
Turner's forensic checklist for cannibalism is based on the science of taphonomy. He studies bones that were manipulated at or near the time of death.
First off, the parts of the assemblage that we can identify with certainty that are human head parts have burning on the backs of the heads or on the tops of the heads, but never on the face. So the head has been placed on a fire for a length of time that caused the charring and the burning and the damage on the outside, but no damage on the inside.
The skull was intact, the brain still inside. In short, it was being roasted, prepared for a meal. Brain is nutritious food, rich in calories and high in protein.
After the roasting, the heads are broken open to expose the brain. Take the head, place it on an anvil stone, take a hammer stone, and hit it hard and cause the skull to crack open. The cracking results in the skull breaking into a series of pieces. And we know the fracturing occurred at or around the time of death because these breaks are very, very sharp.
These are the breaks made when bone is fresh, not yet aged and dried out. Extracting the cooked brain left another clear sign of cannibalism. Anvil abrasion, distinctive scraping as bone is smashed between stones.
Now those are particularly important because you cannot get anvil abrasions on a bone that is heavily covered with muscle tissue. You must cut the tissue off first.
Turner also discovered a pattern of tiny V-shaped grooves etched in bone. These were not caused by erosion, nor were they from the teeth marks of carnivores and scavengers, like the biting of coyotes or the gnawing of rodents. They were sharp, parallel cuts, the marks of stone tools slicing away flesh and muscle, cutting down to the bone. For more than a decade, one man has investigated the use of precisely these kinds of prehistoric tools. Archaeologist Bruce Bradley crafts his own stone blades, or flakes. His work parallels Turner's field demonstrations, but Bradley is a specialist in these tools and their use for butchering game. He experiments firsthand to see if the markings he leaves behind match those left by the old hunters.
I'm gonna make another sharp flake here.
Bradley works on a butcher shop sheep, in place of the wild game that the ancient hunters would have processed.
It's the contact. We're going to cut in these connective tissues like these tendons, like this tendon here. They're the tough things. Meat's easy to cut, but these tendons are tough. And you got a lot of tendons attaching right to the ends of the bone, right at your joints. And that's why you've got to get in there. And you also have, they run underneath, so you can't get at them very easily. You can't see what you're doing, you just sort of got to feel it. Like there, I got between the bone there. A lot of times when butchering, depends on what you want to do with this stuff. If I'm after the marrow, then I need to disarticulate it so I can smash it, clean it and smash it. And I got to flex it so that I can get right in where those tendons that go between the bones, right inside the joint.
Bradley is not investigating cannibalism among the ancients. He is just looking at how hunters left signs of their work on butchered bones.
End up having to sort of twist it and pull on it. There we go. Like that.
Like a detective interpreting a murder scene, Bradley retraces every step a hunter takes to butcher a carcass. His work is a type of experimental archaeology, aimed at discovering the actual techniques ancient people used.
Right here you can see the cut marks on the bone. And this occurred when I was cutting earlier and cut into the end of the bone. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just do that final cutting here, that last little bit.
In the end, The marks left on these bones match both ancient animal bones and the human bones that Turner has studied. Even the location of the cut marks themselves match. Most are near the end of the bones by the joints, where tendons hold muscle tight. But cut marks were not the only clues that Turner found in the human assemblages. After the big pieces of flesh had been removed and the long bones of the arms and legs scraped clean, they were put on a stone and shattered. The apparent goal? What was inside the bone? The marrow. One of the primary sources of fat available to those living in the region, bone marrow was a valuable resource. And Turner discovered something else in the bones that was significant.
The length of these fragments is the same in humans and in game animals. They're breaking the bones up even to the same length.
And that was the length of bone that would fit into the ancient cooking pots. The pots themselves created another mark that argued for cannibalism. As the stew was cooked and stirred, the pots left behind a unique trace on the ends of the bones: pot polish.
The polishing is due to the bone having been stirred around in the inside of an abrasive cooking vessel, a ceramic vessel where the inside is somewhat like sandpaper. The polishing reflects the light differently than the regular perimortem fracture.
Turner's conclusion? Overwhelming evidence for cannibalism. Human beings process the same as game animals. But there was also a clue in what was missing.
One of the key elements that is absent are these particular bones of the body found in the back that we call vertebrae. It means that vertebrae had been essentially destroyed. And we think this is caused by nothing more than the people smashing the vertebrae to extract the marrow that's present in them, as well as in the long bones, the femur, arms, and so forth. We have the breakage, we have the cutting, we have the burning, we have anvil abrasions, we have the polishing, and we add this sixth character, the missing vertebrae. And that's our goal, is to make the test for cannibalism very, very severe, so that we don't get false cases of cannibalism being interpreted or being proposed. Bottom line, this stuff is being processed the same way as game animals. Look, that's all game food. They're eating it, okay? If I turn my back and tell you that this is human, why are you going to reject it as having been eaten when you just accepted the same bones as having been eaten as game animals?
Despite the persuasive evidence of cannibalism, some scientists are still not convinced. In fact, there are those who believe that Turner is not just wrong, but that he is inflicting a new violence on American Indians.
To call somebody a cannibal is dehumanizing. You make them less than human than you are. But there's a long tradition in the United States of science trying to dehumanize Native Americans. I'm not saying that Christy Turner is consciously doing that, but I think when the idea of cannibalism gets picked up by the media, it takes on a life of its own, it becomes fact, and it has that consequence of dehumanizing Native American populations, and particularly Hopi.
And that's what gets lost, and oftentimes that's what really the Pueblo people and other Indian people find very difficult to deal with, because they are human beings with human feelings. And to talk in these generalities, well, they this or this culture that, is dehumanizing. To me, the verdict is out on whether violence really played a major role in the Chacoan system. Certainly there's some aberrations. They happen in any society. They happen in families. How do you determine whether something's domestic violence versus institutionalized violence? Southwestern archaeology, I'd estimate less than 0.1% of what happened in the past is known. To take a few relatively isolated areas and expand those and then say make generalities for the whole Puebloan world, I think is really not warranted at this point in time. We really are looking at a very, very tiny page of a book, maybe half a page of a 200-page book, and that's what we're working on. and then we're generalizing from that. You know what it is really? Is when you come right down to it, we make a lot of noise about how much evidence we have, and we have diddly squat.
Turner thinks he has plenty of evidence to make his case. But some scientists and American Indians are still lined up against him. Not only are the ancestral Pueblans the most revered of all the inhabitants of the American Southwest, but Turner claims that cannibalism happened at a time and place that marked the very peak of their civilization. From about 900 to 1150 AD, the ancestral Pueblans flourished. At the heart of their society was Chaco Canyon. The Chaco sphere of influence expanded outward from the canyon, spanning by some estimates roughly 90,000 square miles, an area about the size of Wyoming. A network of 30-foot wide roads stretched across the canyon lands and linked many of the ancestral Pueblans' great houses. More than 150 of them. These were the signature buildings, massive stone structures up to 5 stories high. They represent a style of architecture and urban planning unique to the region. Throughout sat the kivas, circular sunken chambers, believed to have been used as ceremonial gathering places. Around these altars and hearths, hundreds would have gathered for sacred rituals. Here, in the very heart of the culture, Turner argues, cannibalism took place.
It's a really very sensitive subject. He's so removed from it. It's so abstract for him. How could he possibly understand the sensitivity of it?
I think the people who would say I'm insensitive know nothing about me. We're not insensitive to this material. What we are insensitive to is that we're not being politically correct. Being politically correct is not doing science. Science finds the truth, and it takes the community then to deal with that truth. And I think we've found the truth.
Turner examined remains from nearly 80 sites across the Chaco region, and he found that at roughly half of them, his criteria for cannibalism were met. In all, nearly 300 humans processed as game. Massacres and cannibalism. From Upatki on the western edge of Chaco to Salmon Ruin in the north. And even in Chaco Canyon itself, at Pueblo Bonito, perhaps the ceremonial center of the Chaco world. Time and again, Turner found the signatures of cannibalism.
We didn't want to destroy the myth of Chaco Canyon, okay? But we had to find an objective explanation for this damage to human remains. Everything that we have done meets any scientific requirement that there is no other explanation.
By most scientific standards, Turner had his proof. Hundreds of sets of human bones with identical markings found on animals and discarded in similar fashion. But some doubters still argued that the proof was not complete, that one critical link was missing. For while Turner's studies had presented a clear case of human butchering, his detractors wanted hard evidence that the meat had actually been eaten. A few archaeologists and anthropologists suggested that the same processing might possibly be due to other cultural practices, and that actually eating the meat might not have been part of the rituals.
Well, I mean, people kill each other all the time. People don't always eat each other. And so those are two, I mean, you kill somebody, you're either doing it out of self-defense or aggression, or protecting something. When you go to the extent of eating somebody, you're pushed to a more extreme point. I mean, it's one thing to say that the bones were disarticulated and butchered. It's another thing to say that the flesh was consumed. That's a big leap.
But in the early 1990s, a critical piece of evidence turned up in a remote southwestern corner of Colorado. At a site known as Cowboy Wash, excavators found the site of an ancient massacre, where the remains of 24 people, nearly 2/3 of the estimated population, lay scattered on the floor. Forensic studies indicated that the victims met Turner's criteria for cannibalism. There was something else there besides the bones. In the hearth of a kiva, one final insult, a coprolite, desiccated human feces. Evidence that might hold the key to the controversy over consumption. Investigators turned to molecular biochemistry for answers. Richard Myler, a biochemist and professor of pathology at the University of Colorado, is a blood expert and also an amateur archaeologist. He took up the challenge.
What we've been able to do is say, okay, the individuals were probably violently killed. Their bones and bodies had been processed. That all suggests cannibalism, but it doesn't prove it. The question is then, we can bring the concept of cannibalism all the way up to the mouth of the individuals, but you can't prove that they truly ate it.
Marler set out to find that proof, to identify the residue of one human in the excrement of another. But what kind of a test would prove that? It was a scientific challenge never before undertaken.
So we had to find a protein that was only found in skeletal muscles of the legs or the arms, and not found in the gut.
That protein was myoglobin. Human myoglobin could only show up in a person's feces one way, if he had consumed a human. Marler prepared his test with the utmost diligence. There could be no false positives for animal myoglobin or for other human proteins that might have entered the intestinal tract. Finally, after months of preparations, he was ready. Marler performed 6 sets of tests using small fragments of the coprolite, along with a series of different controls. Blue meant no human remains, but if any turned yellow, it would be irrefutable evidence of human consumption. Marler ran the tests in triplicate over several weeks, and time after time each test came back the same. Positive in the coprolite, positive for human myoglobin.
We did find myoglobin, human myoglobin, in the coprolite. We feel now that it has entered the mouth and passed through the system.
Consumption seems to have been proved, and cannibalism finally demonstrated beyond doubt. But questions remained. Why cannibalism, and who practiced it? Clues come from outside Chaco. Evidence points to numerous cannibal cultures throughout the Americas. Some go back 2,000 years. The practice also occurred in the South Pacific, and in New Guinea it continued well into the 20th century. From the 16th to the 18th centuries, Europeans practiced medicinal cannibalism, believing human blood and body parts cured disease. A recent find in Spain indicates human ancestors were eating each other some 1 million years ago. In the southwest of England, at Gough's Cave, an excavation from the 1980s, led by anthropologist Chris Stringer, revealed a pile of animal bones. But in the same trash heap were human bones. At the Natural History Museum in London, evolutionary anthropologist Peter Andrews and biopaleontologist Yolanda Fernando Yelvo began a year-long analysis of the remains, including this human shoulder blade.
These scrape marks, particularly this one coming down here, cuts right across all those cut marks.
So the main evidences are the similar pattern between animals and humans. If you find all the human remains mixed with the animal remains, and they have the same pattern.
And of course, with the animal bones, the automatic assumption is that what they were doing was butchering the animals to eat. So what we do is compare the damage on the animal bones with the damage done on the human bones. And if they're the same, then the obvious inference is that they were butchering the human bones to eat, just the same as they were doing to the animal bones.
They subjected selected fragments to analysis using even more precise technology, the scanning electron microscope.
It isn't always all that easy to see cut marks on bones, and so it's quite possible that there's a lot of evidence out there with collections already made and might well be related to some form of cannibalism or butchery of some kind, that it just hasn't been observed yet.
Wow, it's beautiful.
That's great, isn't it? Is that a cut there as well?
Magnified 1,000 times, the bone surface shows clear signs of markings from stone tools.
The thing about this is that you can see very clearly that the scrape is cutting across these cuts. Here's a cut coming here, this cut's coming across here, but the scrape was after the cut. But then you'd expect that. The scrape should be after a cut.
Yeah. Keep going through
The marks left by these Stone Age nomadic hunter-gatherers are almost identical to those left by the ancestral Pueblans in the American Southwest. For some, the conclusion is obvious.
Probably all populations, all races, all people, at one stage or another, have practiced cannibalism. And it's a very characteristic thing about being human. Are we prepared to accept that our ancestors were cannibals?
As scientists suggest that cannibalism is a recurrent theme in human history, they are also providing theories that help explain its causes. Humans as a source of food is one of the strongest mechanisms at work here. The mix of human and animal bones points to hunger as a driving force. This is commonly known as survival cannibalism. Whether practiced by plane crash survivors or pioneers, this form of emergency cannibalism will likely never disappear. In 1846, members of the Donner Party, a wagon train of 87 destined for California, were stranded by a blizzard in the Sierra Nevadas. They were forced to endure one of the worst winters on record. Only about half lived to tell their tale of survival, and some admit to fending off starvation by practicing cannibalism. Could hunger have been the primary force leading to Turner's cannibalism? The Southwest has historically been a marginal land, water and food chronically scarce. But ice core samples and tree ring analysis from around the world show that the years 900 to 1150 were marked by a warming trend. In the Southwest, food may have been easier to cultivate, game easier to catch, a time of plenty. So survival cannibalism was probably not the driving mechanism here. But Harvard archaeologist Stephen LeBlanc, an expert on prehistoric warfare and violence in the American Southwest, pursued the possibility that food was the reason for cannibalism. He did some gruesome calculations.
The average event seems to represent maybe 5 or 7 people, but some of them seem to represent perhaps 30 people. And those are the ones that are hardest to explain. That the number of people that it would have taken to have consumed 30 individuals is really staggering, maybe 200 to 400 people. You try to compute just how much meat would have been consumed in one of these events. It turns out to be hundreds of pounds of meat.
So much meat, in fact, that those practicing cannibalism would have been wasting a valuable resource if they were going strictly after food. Another kind of cannibalism is related to worship and the reverence for the dead. Various cultures around the world, most notably in South America and the South Pacific, believe consuming portions of the dead helps keep their spirits alive. A symbolic form of this kind of worship is part of some Western religions as well. Turner's 30-year study included 15,000 skeletal remains. 500 showed signs of violent death. Another 300 were butchered and consumed. In all, 1 in 50 victims of cannibalism. Cases included men, women, and children. Since their bones were discarded like those of animals, indicating inhumane treatment of the dead, ancestral worship seems unlikely. Cannibalism is sometimes associated with warfare, ritual consumption of the enemy dead. Stephen LeBlanc sees evidence of warfare and violence throughout the history of the ancient Southwest. And he argues that the evidence is found not just in the human remains, but in the kinds of buildings constructed and where they are built.
Well, the walls are part of the defensive component of this site. That this community not only was sited on the top of this knoll, but they then built around the exterior walls that originally stood at least 2 stories high. Probably 100 people or so lived in this community. Everything that they had to eat, all the firewood that they needed, the water that they needed, all had to be hauled up this hill, up into this fortress. So they weren't up here because it was fun. They were up here because they had to be up here. This is a very unpleasant place to live, really. It's windy in the spring. It's likely to get hit by lightning during the summer thunder showers. It's really a sort of a miserable place, actually, and most people in the world don't live on tops of mountains. And so you sort of ask yourself, why are they up here? This doesn't seem to make any sense. Then when you go one step further and say, what's everyone else doing? And you look over there and you see that they're all on the tops of hills, and that all the tops of the hills are intervisible with each other so that one can see each other. Then you begin to see an even larger pattern of this concern for defense. People were really being killed. There really were massacres. If you didn't build these, you died.
But strangely, during the time when cannibalism reigned, things were different.
You have this fairly long period of 800 to 1,000 years up to about 900 AD with sort of this chronic intermittent warfare. And then, just almost suddenly, it stops. Then you see this period of about 200, 250 years with virtually no warfare. But it's the time when we have this very anomalous treatment of people. And so this anomalous treatment of people doesn't seem to have anything to do with the kind of warfare that we saw before or the kind of warfare that we saw later. And it seems to be very different than what one would predict for this kind of environment, for the number of people that were living here. So it's this 200-year interval that's really so enigmatic.
It was a time of peace, but that was precisely when cannibalism occurred. The mystery continued until Turner and his colleagues began to notice a pattern.
It was very interesting then to see that indeed almost all of his cases of what he thinks are cannibalistic events fall within the distribution zone of the Chaco and Great Houses, and they fall in time from about 900 to 1150. That is the time of the Chacoan phenomenon.
Almost all excavated great houses show signs of violence, and 2/3 within Chaco show signs of cannibalism. It was a major breakthrough, and it indicated that cannibalism and the Chaco great houses were inextricably linked. Not only was the Chaco era unique in its achievements, it was now set apart by its cannibalism. But there was something else distinct about Chaco. Turner and others saw outside influences at work here. In the architecture, there were signs of cultures from far to the south. The Mesoamericans, Toltecs, and other ancient peoples from today's Valley of Mexico. Below the Chaco-style great house of Wupatki, there is a ball court, an integral part of the Mesoamerican culture. And throughout Chaco Canyon itself, the ruins suggested to Turner a Mesoamerican influence, especially at Chetroquetl, the largest of the great houses.
It has a wall that runs for a block at least, a city block at least, with columns in it, with columns that are exactly like the columns you see in many Mesoamerican sites. Okay, sometime after Tetrachetl was built, after they built those columns, that facade, somebody filled those things in. But initially, in the early part of that construction, it was something like nothing had occurred here in the Southwest previously. This is so big, but when I look at this stuff, I see something here that is so much bigger than local evolution could possibly have produced. This is something that came in here. I have to have a mechanism to bring this cannibalism into the Southwest, okay?
Turner was looking for something more concrete than signs of Mesoamerican influence in the Chacoan architecture. Had Mesoamericans themselves come to the canyon?
And we sort of looked all over the potential kinds of evidence that we could find, and it's sort of eureka. We could identify Mexicans by their modified teeth, because in the Valley of Mexico and throughout Mesoamerica, people modify their teeth by chipping, filing, inlaying, drilling them and doing all kinds of things to them. So if we have got some individuals here in the Southwest with dental modification, the odds are very good that they're from Mexico, because there is no tradition of tooth modification in California, the Great Basin, the Rocky Mountains, the Southwest, the Great Plains, you name it.
Once again, re-examining the bones from here at Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, Turner made a significant discovery. A single skull with filed teeth.
I think we've got the direct link between Mesoamerica and the Southwest.
But the direct link is dependent on just one piece of evidence, that lone skull. This may be problematic to many, but not to Turner. There is plenty of evidence for ancient violence and mistreatment of humans throughout Mesoamerica, and Turner uses this to further his controversial connection.
So, what do I say? I've got a Mexican over here someplace with chipped teeth. I've got cannibalism in 3 or 4 rooms somewhere around here. I see Mexico.
What is now Mexico City was once the capital of a vast Mesoamerican empire, and the remnants of an ancient culture offer him an explanation for the source of cannibalism back in Chaco Canyon. These are the ruins of Templo Mayor, an immense ceremonial complex built by the Aztecs, whose bloodthirsty reputation is part of a tradition of violence among the peoples of Mesoamerica that began centuries before Chaco. The earlier Olmecs and Toltecs, along with the Aztecs, all held a deep reverence for human sacrifice and ritual consumption. Fierce and demanding deities needing to be appeased, the god and goddess of death were idols with exposed ribs and sliced organs. Aztec records attest to this cult of blood. In surviving codices, there are images of sacrifice and consumption, pictures of dismemberment, decapitation, and bodies being boiled. Early Spanish records report hearing about gruesome ceremonies in which thousands of captives were bent backwards over this dark stone slab and sacrificed to voracious gods. The still beating hearts of victims would have been deposited in this ceremonial vessel. Parts of the bodies were recorded as having been consumed by priests, investing them, they thought, with godlike qualities. And hundreds of years later, their bones ended up here. The National Museum of Anthropology and History in Mexico City houses 20,000 skeletal remains excavated from some 600 archaeological sites in Mexico. Physical anthropologist Carmen Pilloen has been doing extensive taphonomic studies on Mesoamerican bones that go back to at least 500 BC. And as Pilloen has studied the bones, she has found the signs of savage treatment. Ritual cannibalism, and perhaps even more bizarre processes.
They thought about using the body of the sacrifice victims in any way they could.
Bones were crafted into tools and ornaments. Longer bones from arms and legs were made into ritual musical instruments.
And they made some deep cuts on the shaft of the long bones, and they played it like this.
And skulls were put to use as well.
A hole was punched very carefully on the bottom of the skull. The hole was this size, and the mandible is his. So what I propose here is the skull was afterwards put on a pole as a trophy.
And they weren't just single trophies. Carefully punching holes in the sides of the skull, the Mesoamericans would run a pole through and string many skulls together. In one find, a skull rack consisted of 170 skulls. The purpose seems clear: to frighten and subjugate all those who might oppose them. For the Mesoamericans, human sacrifice brought order to the world. It preserved the theocratic system. It sated the gods with blood. And it kept the elite in power, to dominate the masses and crush dissent. But just before the beginning of the Chaco era, a time of great civil anarchy rocked this world. It is known that many fled the Valley of Mexico. The crux of Turner's theory, and his most controversial proposition yet, is that a small cult came north, traveling up to Chaco Canyon carrying their bloody beliefs with them. He believes that when this fierce group encountered the ancestral Pueblans, they found a peaceful, pliant people who were easy to subjugate. According to Turner, the Mesoamerican cult set out to recreate the same system they had left behind, a culture of intimidation and social control.
They needed some kind of weapon, and certainly cannibalism would serve as a weapon. You don't have to kill a lot of people to make your point. And they use cannibalism as a threat. It's a terrifying thing. We're afraid of it ourselves. I mean, the revulsion we have is in part because we can imagine ourselves being consumed. And I can imagine word getting out that we've got cannibals in our midst would bring about a lot of social control with very, very little effort.
So Turner suggests that the inhabitants of the Chaco region may not have been the cannibals, but their victims.
I think the terrorism idea, one form or another, in my mind, is the strongest hypothesis we have. If it's people treating other people as though they're animals and butchering them in the same way that you would an animal, and even consuming the result, that that probably is intended to send a political message, warning. It's a warning against other people not to do something that these people are accused of having done.
It seems to scientists like Wilcox and Turner that for at least 2.5 centuries, some group practiced cannibalism to secure control over a vast area of the American Southwest. But somewhere around 1150 AD, things began to change. Environmental conditions took a turn for the worse. The climate became cold and dry. Crops began to fail. Game became scarce. It was a time of drought, starvation, and disease. And the Chaco reign came to an end. At the same time, signs of cannibalism in the skeletal record wane, indicating the decline of Chaco corresponds to the end of cannibalism. It took Christy Turner most of his professional career to gather his evidence for cannibalism, prove his case, and gain support for his theory. But controversy surrounding him has not abated. Turner's latest theory, the Mesoamerican connection, has provoked heated debate, sparked new research, and kept alive the mystery of cannibalism in the canyon.
With online experiments and new forensic evidence, find more answers to history's greatest mysteries at pbs.org. Secrets of the Dead was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
This is PBS.